Alright, what's going on everybody? It is your SI Tandon here, just with a quick video on voice threads. Professor Camilleri and I, we get a number of students who really hate the voice threads. And I get why. If you've ever recorded a voicemail and then listened to it back later, or if you recorded a video of yourself and you're singing and you think you sound really good and then you realize you don't, it can be really cringy to hear your voice back in those contexts. And I think that's just because humans weren't meant to hear our voices back like that. It's just really unnatural. Microphones and recording devices have only been around the past 100 years. So it's totally natural to not like the sound of your own voice. But there is some stuff we can do to be more comfortable and confident before we press record. So I'm just going to give you 3 tips on, how to do that. So number 1 is to read your work aloud before you press record. And I would actually just extend that to read your work aloud. I always read my work aloud, any written piece aloud, whether I plan on, making a video on it like this or not. Reading your work aloud just helps you understand flow. It'll help point out the spots where you're like, oh, maybe I should, restructure that sentence to just make it sound a little bit better. Or maybe these parts are pretty similar, so it actually sounds kind of redundant, so I can take one of those out. Reading your work aloud really does help, point out the spots that you would have missed if you were just reading it on a screen. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to be comfortable, or to try to get comfortable with the pause, which is basically just what it is. It's a pause, right? Rather than defaulting to those ums or likes, which aren't necessarily bad in everyday conversation, and they're natural, I think, in everyday conversation. I say like all the time. But when it comes to performing, which is kind of what we're doing here, when it comes to performing, a written piece, the ums or the likes can kind of dilute, right, the what we were saying beforehand. So if you're making a really big, bold claim, and then afterwards you go, or, but like, it kind of detracts from that. So getting comfortable just pausing will help you not just with recording stuff in general, but with life in general. If you go into, I just said but if you go into a job interview and you're if but, right, if you're stuttering your whole way through, you don't seem that confident. But if you're comfortable just pausing, right, and really taking your time, and the person asks you a question, you kind of just sit there for a few seconds, that kind of exudes this confidence that will come through. So that's tip number 2, is to try to get comfortable with the pause. Number 3 is to think of the emotions, right, that are behind or kind of buried into the piece of writing that you have, and match your voice or your energy with those emotions. So if you have a really, somber, sad, distraught sort of story, you're probably not starting in this very happy, light, airy, sort of voice or tone, unless your story starts in this sort of light character or light, scene, and then descends into a sad story. Then maybe it makes sense to start narrating it kind of happily and then more sadly, right? So, you could do that sort of storytelling where you literally change your emotion throughout. Or if your story has an overarching emotion, right, maybe the whole story is just kind of anger, that's the only emotion that comes to mind, then maybe you just are kind of angry when you're speaking the whole time, and that comes through. So those 3 things, I think, are just really helpful in getting confident before you press record, right? Because all 3 of these things you can do before you even press record, right? You can read your work aloud while you're reading it aloud if you kind of stutter, or if you, mess up. You can get comfortable pausing rather than feeling like you have to fill that, airtime. And you can think of the emotions and the intent behind the piece before you even press record. So I make this big effort of thinking of these things before you press record, because so often I feel like students hit the record button and then they either kind of start fumbling because they're like, oh my god, what was I planning on saying, right? And they stutter their way through. Maybe some of it makes sense, but they lose us at some points. Or they just start reading their piece verbatim off the page. And it sounds kind of like they plugged it into a robot and then they pressed translate, and it's just reading it, which isn't a bad thing, but it's a voice thread for a reason. We're trying to get you guys to elevate the written piece into a spoken piece, right? So that's all my tips I have. I don't want to keep you here for too long, but if you have questions, comments, concerns, my office hours will be tomorrow at the time of posting, which is Thursday from 2 to 5 p.m., and you can stop by there. Or you can always email me, Tannonarceo, TANNINARCEO @gmail.com, and we can set up a time to meet, outside of those hours. So best of luck. I'm excited to see what you guys have, and yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you need help. And I will see you soon. All right, bye.